Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going way back to the 19th century to explore the world of pathology reports and how patients like you have come to understand them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and the sources you sent in for this one are, well, they're all over the place. We've got early papers on like the very beginnings of surgical pathology.
Wow.
And then research on how well patients, actually grasp what these reports are saying. And even, get this, notes from a 2008 meeting of pathologists in Italy.
Sounds like a good time.
I'm really curious about that one, actually.
Well, that meeting, it actually reflects this really big shift in healthcare, toward patient empowerment. And that theme, it runs through all these materials you sent.
I noticed that too. Okay, so to kick things off, let's go back to the 1800s, the very start of surgical pathology.
Okay.
What can you tell me about those early days, like before we had all the fancy technology we have now?
Well, before the mid-1800s, doctors, they could only really observe what was going on inside the body during surgery,
Right.
or, well, after death.
Oh, right.
But then we have these two pioneers, Karl von Rokitansky
Okay.
and Rudolf Virchow. They totally changed how we understood disease.
Those names were mentioned in that paper from Emory, weren't they?
Yes, Rokitansky, he did over 30,000 autopsies in Vienna.
Wow. 30,000.
Yeah, meticulously linking what he saw to each patient's medical history, and this laid the foundation for understanding how disease actually shows up in the body.
That's incredible. But how could they actually see the diseases, in detail? I mean, weren't microscopes still pretty basic back then?
Well, Virchow, he was working in Berlin, and he knew even then that microscopy was the key.
Okay.
He said you got to examine tissues at the cellular level to really get it, to understand what's going on. His 1858 book, Cellular Pathology, that changed everything, really set the stage for modern medicine, actually.
So we go from autopsies to looking at individual cells. That's a huge jump.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story.
Yeah.
What else was needed to get us to, like, the really detailed pathology reports we see today?
Well, before you can analyze anything under a microscope, you got to prepare the tissue samples, right?
Right.
So a few crucial innovations came along in the 19th century that made that possible.
Like what?
Well, for example, Joseph Lister, father of the famous surgeon,
Yep.
he developed achromatic lenses for microscopes.
Okay.
Before that, the lenses would distort the colors.
Oh, wow.
So you couldn't really do detailed analysis.
Yeah, that makes sense. A clear picture is kind of important.
Haha, yeah. So what else? In 1869, Edward Cleggs, he figured out how to embed tissue samples in paraffin wax.
Okay.
This let them create super thin sections that were stable enough to cut and study.
Interesting.
And then 1893, Ferdinand Bloom, he discovers that formaldehyde can fix tissues and stop them from decaying.
So suddenly, thanks to these guys, pathologists had clear, preserved samples that they could slice up really thin and look at under a powerful microscope. That's wild.
Isn't it?
And all this happening over 150 years ago. It's amazing to think about. It seems like that would have opened up a whole new world for pathology and medicine in general.
Oh, absolutely. And all these innovations, they were happening at the same time as this boom in surgery.
Oh, yeah.
What some call the golden age of surgery.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. I think it was in one of the articles about how before the 1800s, surgery was so risky.
Oh, incredible.
50% chance of survival.
You're exactly right. But then in the mid to late 1800s, all these innovations, they just came one after another.
Right.
Anesthesia to control pain, antisepsis to fight infection,
Yeah.
and huge improvements to surgical techniques themselves. Mortality rates just plummeted.
Wow.
And suddenly, surgery was actually a good option for way more conditions.
So if more people were having surgery, that means, obviously, more biopsies.
Exactly.
And more biopsies means?
Huge demand for surgical pathology. Surgeons needed to know what they were dealing with, and fast. That's when we see these specialized surgeon pathologists emerge.
Like Thomas Cullen at Johns Hopkins and William Clark at Columbia, right?
Exactly. They were both amazing surgeons and experts in analyzing tissues. They were the bridge between the operating room and the lab. Cullen, for instance, he published a ton of research on gynecological cancers.
Oh, wow.
And his work, it was so influential.
So it sounds like all these elements, the microscopy, the tissue preparation, and the surgical boom, they all came together to create modern surgical pathology.
Right, and it shows how science, it builds on itself.
Yeah.
Each discovery leads to the next. But as we move through these sources, chronologically,
Yeah.
we see another important element coming into play, the patient's perspective.
That's what I was thinking. It's so interesting how those early papers were all about the science. from the doctor's point of view.
Right.
But then the newer articles, they start talking about this, like this information gap.
Yeah.
What about the patient understanding all of this?
It's like for so long, the pathology report was only for doctors, not for patients.
Exactly. And there's this 2014 study by Massanen and colleagues that really makes this point. They looked at over 800 articles about pathology reports.
Okay.
And not a single one considered the patient as, like, the intended reader.
Wow, that's telling. Seems like there was a big blind spot there.
I also remember a quote from a pathologist, Gottman, I think, in a 2003 paper. He noticed that most of the patients who asked him for consultations were healthcare workers themselves.
That says a lot, doesn't it? I mean, the average person probably couldn't understand those dense technical reports.
Right. Medical jargon can be super complex.
Yeah.
Even from people who are generally well educated.
Absolutely. But luckily, things are starting to change, These sources you live me, they point to all kinds of patient-centered initiatives that are trying to make these reports more accessible and, easier to understand.
That's great to hear. Like what, for example?
Oh, there's that frequently asked questions initiative from, I think it was 2010. They gave really clear and simple explanations for common pathology terms, specifically for cancer.
Oh, okay.
Like Pathology 101 for patients, simple but powerful.
Yeah, that makes sense. What else?
Well, there's a 2015 study by Mangano and his team. They created this consultation clinic for diagnostic radiology.
Okay.
They found that patients really liked being able to actually sit down with the radiologist and have their scans explained in detail. Makes you wonder if something like that could work for pathology,
That's a great point. Like, if radiologists can explain those complex images,
right?
Why not pathologists explaining what they see in the tissue samples?
Exactly. It made me think of that case from a 2012 paper by Menek.
Okay.
It was about a woman with cervical cancer who was determined to really understand her diagnosis. She ended up going straight to a pathologist because she felt her doctor wasn't giving her enough info.
Wow, that's amazing. It just shows how much patients want to be more involved in their own healthcare,
Yeah, it's not just about getting information, it's about understanding it.
Totally. It makes you wonder, what if these direct consultations between patients and pathologists were more common? Like, what if it wasn't the exception, but, the standard of care?
That's a fascinating question. And actually, one of your sources, it proposes a model for exactly that.
That's what I love about these deep dives. There's always something new to discover. But before we get into that, let's take a minute to let all this sink in. It's a lot to process.
I agree.
So before we get too lost in the history here, you mentioned a source that proposes a model for more direct communication between patients and pathologists.
Yes, it's a 2018 paper by Gibson and his colleagues. They outline this concept called the Pathology Explanation Clinic, or PPEC. Basically, it's the system where patients can have appointments, dedicated appointments with a pathologist.
Okay.
To go over their tissue samples and their reports, in a way that actually makes sense.
That's a fantastic idea. I mean, imagine you get your pathology report back.
Yeah.
And it's full of medical jargon.
Totally.
You're feeling lost, maybe a little scared, instead of trying to figure it all out yourself.
Yeah.
Or even worse, going to Dr. Google.
Oh, no, not Dr. Google.
You can actually sit down with the pathologist who looked at your tissue.
Right.
That would be so reassuring. But how would this PPEC model actually work in practice?
Well, the authors suggest that it wouldn't be like a separate service.
Okay.
It would be built into existing clinical workflows, maybe linked to visits with the patient's doctor.
That makes sense. So it's not an extra trip to the hospital.
Right.
But it seems like it would take more than just adding some appointments to the schedule.
Yeah.
Pathologists, well, they aren't exactly known for their communication skills, right?
That's a good point.
Not to stereotype or anything, but they're more comfortable in the lab than at the bedside, I'd imagine.
You're right, and the paper addresses that. They propose creating certified pathologist navigators.
Okay.
Basically, these would be pathologists who have extra training in communication skills.
Okay.
So they're not only experts in analyzing tissues,
right,
but they're also really good at explaining it to patients in plain language.
So like a museum guide, but for the microscopic world.
Exactly. Instead of just staring at a confusing report, you'd have this expert walking you through it, showing you what's what.
I love that analogy. So they could answer your questions, calm your fears,
yeah,
and really help you make decisions about your health care.
Exactly. That's the goal.
Now, that's patient-centered care. But is there, any proof that these PAs actually make a difference? Are there studies showing that they improve outcomes or, patient satisfaction?
There is some evidence. Several of the sources you sent, they highlight the potential benefits.
Okay, good. Like what?
Well, there's a 2015 study by Nishimaki and his colleagues.
Okay.
They looked at a pathology clinic for patients with breast cancer.
Okay.
They found that the clinic visits, they actually reduced anxiety levels, at least in the short term.
That makes sense. I guess knowledge is power, right?
Yeah, for sure. Understanding your diagnosis can help with some of that fear and uncertainty that comes with, a serious illness.
Absolutely. Is there any evidence that pixies can, lead to patients actually sticking with their treatment plans better?
There's a really interesting anecdote in a 2019 paper by Booth.
Oh, tell me about it.
It's about this woman with breast cancer who, after seeing her own tumor cells
Wow.
and understanding what estrogen receptor positive really meant for her,
Mm-hmm.
she realized that she should have been taking her tamoxifen more consistently.
That's amazing. So by giving patients a deeper understanding of their pathology, you're actually helping them take control of their health. It's a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely. Informed patients, they tend to make better choices,
right?
And that leads to better outcomes.
This PPEC model, it sounds like a missing piece in patient care.
It really does.
But I know there are always challenges with implementing new models, especially in healthcare.
Oh, of course.
What did the sources say about potential hurdles or, drawbacks?
Well, several sources point to challenges, both logistical and financial. For example, the 2018 Gibson paper, the one about the PPEC model, it highlights how hard it would be to integrate these clinics into busy hospital workflows.
Yeah, I could see that. Hospital schedules are already so packed. Plus, there's the cost, right?
Definitely. The financial side is a big factor. There's a 2021 paper by Jug and colleagues.
Okay.
And they bring up the issue of, getting insurance companies to actually pay for pathologist consultations.
Right. So that could be a barrier for patients.
It could.
It always seems like there's a gap between what's best for patients and what's, financially feasible.
Unfortunately, yeah.
What other concerns did the sources mention?
Well, a 2020 paper by Mehrali and his colleagues, they bring up a really important point about equity and access.
Okay.
They say it's crucial to make sure that PCs are available to all patients.
Yeah.
Including people from different backgrounds with different levels of health literacy and those who might face language barriers.
That's so important. We don't want to create a system where only the most educated patients benefit.
Exactly. PICs need to be designed so that everyone benefits.
It seems like even though there are challenges, there's real momentum building for this more patient-centered approach to pathology.
Oh, absolutely. More and more researchers, pathologists, and patient advocates, they're all pushing for this change. And as we see more evidence for the benefits of PICs,
right,
it seems like support for wider adoption will just keep growing.
That's exciting to think about. This whole conversation has been eye-opening, really.
I agree.
We've gone from the early days of autopsies and basic microscopes all the way to this new frontier of patient empowerment.
It's been quite a journey.
It makes me wonder, what do you see for the future of pathology reports?
Interesting.
Will we even have those traditional, long, confusing reports in 10 or 20 years?
That's a great question. If we look at the trends we've talked about, the focus on patients' understanding, the rise of technology, the desire for personalized healthcare, I think it's safe to say that the traditional pathology report, as we know it, it's probably going to change, maybe even radically.
So no more of those reports that only doctors can understand. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Do you think we'll see, a simplified version alongside the traditional one? Sort of like an executive summary for your health?
It's possible, but I think we might see something even cooler, something more innovative.
Like what?
Imagine a dynamic report online.
Okay.
With images, videos, even 3D models of your own tissues.
Whoa, that's incredible.
Right. Instead of just reading about your biopsy, you could actually see what's going on.
That would make it so much more real for patients.
Exactly. And imagine clicking on different parts of the report and getting explanations in plain language.
Oh, wow.
Or links to research articles and clinical trials.
That would be amazing.
It would be a truly personalized experience, tailored just for you.
Okay, I am totally geeking out now. This sounds like sci-fi. What about those pathology explanation clinics? Do you think those will become, standard?
They could, but we might also see other forms of communication, beyond just in-person visits. Think telehealth, secure messaging.
Right.
Maybe even Q&A sessions built into those multimedia reports we were talking about.
That makes sense. Not everyone can travel to a clinic.
Exactly. But with those other options, no matter where you are, what your schedule is like, or how comfortable you are with technology, you can still connect with the pathologist.
And get your questions answered.
Yes. And don't forget about AI.
Oh, right.
AI could personalize those reports even more, highlighting important findings, recommending specific resources.
That's incredible.
It could even help predict how you might respond to treatments, giving you even more information to work with.
Now we're talking about the future of healthcare. It's mind-blowing. It seems like we're on the edge of a whole new era in pathology.
Yeah.
One where patients are true partners in their care.
That's the whole idea of patient-centered care, empowering people with knowledge, giving them a voice, and creating a real partnership between patients and their healthcare team.
I love that. This deep dive has been so thought-provoking.
It has.
To our listener out there.
Yeah.
Keep exploring these sources and let your imagination run wild.
Yeah, what do you envision for the future of pathology?
It's an exciting time to be involved in healthcare. I think the future is great.
Me too. But remember, it takes all of us working together.
Yeah.
Patients, providers, researchers, everyone.
So well said. And on that inspiring note, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and be an active participant in your own healthcare journey. Okay, so we're back, and I'm still kind of blown away by all this pathology stuff.
It's pretty fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It's amazing how far we've come, with technology and thinking to patients more.
Yeah, definitely.
But before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to circle back to that question you asked before about what the future holds for pathology reports.
Oh, right, the big crystal ball question.
Yeah, exactly. Like, will we even have those traditional, long and confusing reports in 10 or 20 years?
Well, if we look at all the stuff we've talked about, the focus on patients' understanding, technology, personalized healthcare, I think it's pretty safe to say those old school pathology reports are going to change, maybe even a lot.
So no more reports that only doctors can decipher. Good riddance, I say.
Maybe. So do you think we'll see like a simplified version, for patients?
Yeah, like a plain language version alongside the technical one. Sort of like, an executive summary, but for your health.
That's a possibility, but I think it could be even more, more interactive.
Oh, interesting.
Imagine like a dynamic report online.
Okay.
With images, videos, maybe even 3D models of your own tissues.
Wow, that would be amazing. Instead of just reading about it,
yeah,
you could actually see what's going on.
Exactly. It would make it so much more real and understandable. And imagine you could click on different parts of the report and get like plain language explanations or links to research articles, even clinical trials.
Okay, that's next level. That would be amazing.
Right. A truly personalized learning experience just for you.
So cool. What about those pathology explanation clinics?
Yeah.
You think those will become more common?
They might, but we could also see more, flexible ways to communicate.
Okay.
Not just in-person visits. Think telehealth, secure messaging, maybe even Q&As built into those multimedia reports.
That makes sense. Not everyone can get to a clinic. But having those other options means that no matter where you live, how busy you are, or how comfortable you are with tech, you can still talk to the pathologist.
Exactly. And let's not forget about AI.
Oh, right, AI. It's everywhere these days.
It really is. And it could make those pathology reports even more personalized, pointing out important stuff, suggesting resources.
Yeah. Yep.
It could even help predict how someone might respond to treatment, giving them more information to make decisions with.
That's really incredible. We've come a long way from those early days of pathology, haven't we?
We have.
It feels like we're entering this whole new era where patients are real partners in their own care.
And that's what it's all about, right? Giving people knowledge, a voice, making sure there's a true partnership between patients and their healthcare team.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has given me so much to think about.
Me too.
To everyone listening out there, keep exploring these sources and let your imagination run wild. What do you think the future of pathology looks like?
It's an exciting time to be involved in healthcare. I'm optimistic about what's ahead.
Me too. But it takes all of us working together, right? Patients, doctors, researchers, everyone.
Absolutely.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It was great having you. Until next time, everyone, stay curious, keep learning, and be active in your own healthcare journey.